Before anyone asks about my will tonight, there is something you should know about me that I have hidden for 30 years. The room became so quiet that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. That was how my 74th birthday dinner began. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and until that evening, not a single person in my family knew the truth. Not my son Daniel, not my daughter-in-law Rachel, not even my granddaughter Sophie, who had always been closer to me than anyone else. They thought they knew me. They thought they understood why I made certain choices and why I kept parts of my life locked away. They were wrong. The dinner was being held at Daniel and Rachel's house just outside Columbus, Ohio. It was a beautiful September evening. The dining room table was covered with flowers, candles, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Family members filled every chair. Laughter bounced off the walls. From the outside, it looked like the kind of birthday celebration people post on social media. Perfect, warm, loving. But families are complicated. Sometimes the people sitting closest to you are the ones who understand you the least. Rachel had spent most of the evening talking about practical matters. She always called them practical matters. The house, investments, savings accounts, future plans. Every conversation somehow drifted toward money. You should really think about making everything clear, she said while passing a bowl of mashed potatoes. It would save everyone a lot of confusion later. She smiled when she said it, but I knew exactly what she meant. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sophie rolled her eyes and looked down at her plate. I simply smiled and took a sip of iced tea. This was not the first time Rachel had brought up inheritance. It was not even the 10th. Over the years, I had learned that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. After dinner, Sophie carried out the birthday cake. Everyone sang. I blew out the candles. Cameras flashed. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the happiness on their faces. Then I remembered why I had come. Earlier that morning, I had climbed into my attic and retrieved a dusty wooden box that had not been opened in decades. It now sat beside my chair, hidden beneath a folded blanket. 30 years. That is a long time to carry a secret. Long enough to build an entire life around it. Long enough for people to create their own explanations. Long enough for misunderstandings to harden into facts. When the cake was finished and the gifts had been opened, I slowly stood from my chair. I have something I would like to say, I announced. Conversation stopped immediately. Rachel straightened in her seat. Daniel looked curious. Sophie smiled warmly. I bent down, lifted the old wooden box, and placed it on the center of the table. Dust clung to the corners. The brass latch showed signs of age. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. What is that? Sophie asked. I rested my hand gently on the lid. For a moment, I could not speak. Memories crowded my mind. Faces, places, decisions, regrets. The weight of 3 decades pressed against my chest. Then I looked around the room at the people I loved most. Everything you think you know about me began with a lie, I said softly. Rachel's smile vanished. Daniel frowned. No one moved. For 30 years, I have kept a promise that changed all of our lives. My voice trembled slightly before growing steady again. And tonight, I am finally going to tell you why. No one reached for the box. No one spoke. Even Rachel, who always seemed to have something to say, sat perfectly still. I looked around the table and saw confusion on every face. That did not surprise me. For 30 years, I had worked very hard to make sure nobody discovered the truth. I had convinced myself it was the right thing to do. At the time, it felt necessary. Later, it became a habit. Eventually, it became part of who I was. I rested my fingers on the worn wooden lid and took a slow breath. To understand this story, I said, you have to go back 30 years. Daniel leaned forward. Sophie sat quietly beside him. Rachel folded her arms. Outside, the last light of evening was fading beyond the kitchen windows. Back then, your father was still alive, I continued. We lived in a small house about 15 miles from here. We did not have much money, but we had enough. At least that is what everyone believed. The room remained silent. I opened the box but did not remove anything yet. Instead, I looked down at the contents. Letters, photographs, old receipts, documents yellowed with age. Every piece of paper carried a memory I had spent decades trying not to revisit. When people think about the past, they usually remember the happy parts, I said softly. The birthday parties, the vacations, the holiday dinners. They do not see what happened behind closed doors. Daniel frowned. Mom, what are you talking about? I met his eyes. I am talking about the year everything changed. His expression grew serious. For a moment, he looked less like a 50-year-old man and more like the young boy I used to tuck into bed at night. There was a period when your father and I were struggling more than anyone knew, I said. We never told you because we did not want you to worry. Rachel shifted in her chair. Financial problems? She asked. I nodded slowly. Much worse than anyone realized. Memories flooded back. I remembered unpaid bills hidden in kitchen drawers. I remembered calculating grocery costs down to the last dollar. I remembered nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling while wondering how we would make it through another month. But that was only part of the story. People often assumed I became distant later in life because I was cold. I continued. Or because I cared more about money than family. Rachel looked away. Daniel lowered his eyes. Neither of them denied it. They had believed those things for years. Maybe everyone at the table had. The truth is much different, I said. The person you think I am was created by a promise I made 30 years ago. Sophie whispered, What promise? I smiled sadly. The kind that changes everything. The old grandfather clock in the corner chimed softly. 8 o'clock. I glanced toward the photographs hanging on the wall. Family pictures stretched across decades. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, smiling faces frozen in time. Looking at them, I realized how strange life could be. A single secret could exist beneath hundreds of happy moments. A single decision could shape an entire family without anyone realizing it. Slowly, I reached into the box and lifted out the first item. It was an envelope. Thick, faded, sealed for 3 decades. Sophie stared at it. Daniel looked confused. Rachel appeared uneasy. I held the envelope carefully in both hands. This, I said, is where the truth begins. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. It was only paper, after all. Yet as I held it in my hands, I could feel 30 years pressing against my palms. Everyone at the table watched silently. Sophie leaned forward. Daniel stared at the envelope as though it might answer questions he had carried for years without realizing it. Rachel remained quiet, but I noticed the impatience behind her expression. She wanted to know where this was going. So did everyone else. Carefully, I turned the envelope over. The seal had yellowed with age. The corners were worn. My husband had handed it to me on a rainy evening 3 decades earlier. I could still remember the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen windows that night. Some memories never fade. Your father gave me this, I said softly. Daniel blinked. Dad, I nodded. A few weeks before everything changed. The room grew even quieter. I opened the envelope and removed a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. Strong, careful, familiar. For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. There are some voices you never stop hearing, even after they are gone. My husband had been gone for more than 20 years, but seeing his words again felt like sitting across from him at our old kitchen table. What does it say? Sophie asked. I looked at her and smiled sadly. Not yet. Her shoulders dropped slightly, but she nodded. She understood that some stories cannot be rushed. I folded the letter closed again and placed it gently on the table. Then I reached back into the box and removed an old photograph. Daniel immediately recognized it. That was our house, he said. The first one. Yes, I replied. The picture showed a small white home with a narrow front porch and a maple tree in the yard. Looking at it brought back memories of simpler days. Days before secrets. Days before promises. Days before the distance that slowly grew between me and my son. You were 20 years old when this picture was taken, I said to Daniel. You had just started community college. He nodded. I remember. I studied his face. There was so much of his father in him. The same eyes. The same stubborn determination. For years, that resemblance had made certain memories harder to bear. At that time, I continued, you thought your father and I were doing fine. Were you not? He asked. I shook my head slowly. No, the words seemed to echo through the room. Rachel shifted in her chair. Sophie frowned. How bad was it? She asked quietly. I looked down at the photograph. Bad enough that we were close to losing everything. No one spoke. I could see surprise spreading across their faces. They had never heard this part of the story before. That was not their fault. I had spent 30 years making sure they never did. The strange thing about hardship, I said, is that people often hide it from the ones they love most. They think they are protecting them. I paused. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are only creating larger problems for the future. Daniel lowered his eyes. I could tell he was trying to fit these new pieces into the version of me he had carried in his mind for decades. The cold mother. The distant mother. The woman who never explained herself. But the truth was far more complicated. Slowly, I removed another item from the box. This time it was a faded hospital bracelet. Sophie gasped softly. Daniel stared at it in confusion. Rachel looked genuinely puzzled. I held the bracelet carefully between my fingers. My heart began beating faster. Because this was the moment the story truly started. This was the object connected to the promise that had shaped every year of my life since. And as I looked around the table, I realized that by the end of the night, my family would never see me the same way again. The hospital bracelet rested in my hand like a key to a door I had kept locked for 3 decades. No one at the table spoke. Sophie stared at it. Daniel looked confused. Rachel seemed uncertain for the first time all evening. I understood why. A hospital bracelet was not the kind of thing people expected to find inside a box filled with family photographs and old letters. Slowly, I traced my finger across the faded print. Most of the ink had disappeared long ago, but I did not need to read it. I knew every detail by heart. 30 years ago, I said quietly, your father and I received news that changed our lives forever. Daniel straightened in his chair. The mention of his father always caught his attention, even after all these years. At first, we thought our biggest problem was money. I continued. We were behind on bills. The mortgage was becoming difficult to manage. Every month felt like a race we could not win. But then something happened that made all of those problems seem small. I paused. The memory still carried weight. Not because it was painful anymore. Because it was important. One afternoon, your father came home early from work. He looked different. Quiet. Distracted. I glanced down at the bracelet. He told me we needed to go to the hospital. Sophie lowered her eyes. Daniel remained focused on every word. We spent most of that evening sitting under fluorescent lights while doctors ran tests and asked questions. Neither of us said much. We were frightened, although we tried not to show it. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Eventually, we were given information that would affect every decision we made afterward. Rachel leaned forward slightly. What kind of information? She asked. I looked at her. Then I looked at Daniel. The kind that forces a family to choose what matters most. My answer only deepened the mystery. I knew it would. But this story had lived in shadows for 30 years. It could not be rushed into the light. I placed the bracelet beside the photograph and reached into the box once more. This time I removed a stack of receipts held together with a rubber band that had become brittle with age. These are from that same year, I said. Every dollar we spent. Every dollar we borrowed. Every dollar we saved. Daniel stared at them. You kept all of that? Yes. Why? I smiled sadly. Because I needed to remember what sacrifice looked like. His expression changed slightly. I could see questions forming behind his eyes. Questions he had never considered asking before. For years, he believed he understood why I behaved the way I did. Why I worked extra hours. Why I avoided certain conversations. Why I sometimes seemed distant. The truth was that every choice traced back to that year. Every single one. Sophie reached across the table and gently touched the edge of one receipt. Grandma, she said softly, were you carrying all of this alone? I looked at her and felt my heart tighten. Not at first, I replied. Your grandfather carried it with me. I glanced at the letter still lying unopened beside the box. Then one day, he asked me to make a promise. Daniel frowned. Rachel exchanged a glance with him. What kind of promise? Daniel asked. I took a slow breath. The answer had shaped the last 30 years of my life. A promise that no one in this family would learn the truth until the right time. I looked around the table. And tonight is the first time I have ever broken that silence. The words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reached for their drink. Even Rachel seemed to understand that whatever came next mattered more than anything we had discussed all evening. I looked at the old receipts scattered across the table and remembered how carefully I had saved each one. At the time, they were not pieces of history. They were evidence of survival. After the hospital visit, I said quietly, your father and I knew our lives were going to change. Daniel sat motionless. Sophie watched me with wide eyes. I could see that both of them were trying to connect the fragments I had revealed so far. The hospital bracelet. The financial struggles. The promise. But the picture was still incomplete. For months afterward, every decision became difficult. I continued. We stopped spending money on anything that was not absolutely necessary. We canceled plans. We sold things we cared about. We learned how to stretch every dollar further than I ever thought possible. I picked up one of the receipts and held it toward the light. I kept these because they reminded me that sacrifice has a cost. Not just financially, emotionally too. Daniel lowered his eyes. Is that why you worked so much when I was younger? He asked. I nodded slowly. Partly. The truth was more complicated, but he was beginning to see pieces of it. I remember coming home from school and sometimes finding you gone, he said quietly. I thought you preferred work over being with us. His words carried no anger now, only sadness. I smiled gently. I know you thought that. For years, I had heard variations of the same assumption, that I cared too much about money, that I was distant by choice, that I placed responsibilities ahead of relationships. People often create explanations when they do not know the truth. Eventually, those explanations become facts in their minds. The reality was very different, I said. Every extra hour I worked had a purpose. Every decision I made was connected to something larger. Rachel folded her hands together. Why did you never tell anyone? She asked. It was a fair question, one I had asked myself countless times over the years. Because I made a promise, I answered. And because breaking that promise would have changed how everyone saw your father. The room became silent again. That was the first time I had hinted at his role in the secret. Daniel looked up immediately. Dad, he asked. What did Dad have to do with this? I looked at the letter resting beside the box. For 30 years, I had protected not only a secret, but also a memory. The memory of a good man who had made an impossible request. Your father loved this family more than anything, I said softly. Every decision he made came from that love. Sophie reached for my hand. Grandma, was he trying to protect someone? She asked. Her question caught me off guard because it was closer to the truth than anything anyone had said so far. I squeezed her hand gently. Yes, I replied. He was. A look passed between Daniel and Rachel. I could almost see the questions multiplying in their minds. For the first time all evening, Rachel no longer seemed interested in inheritance or finances. The mystery had become something far more personal. I opened the letter and glanced at the familiar handwriting. My heart tightened. There were moments in life when the past feels distant, like a faded photograph. Then there are moments when it stands directly beside you. This was one of them. Before I tell you what happened, I said, carefully folding the letter again, you need to understand one thing. For 30 years, everyone in this family believed they knew why I changed. The truth is that the person you thought I became never really existed. She was only the mask I wore to keep a promise. The moment those words left my mouth, I saw something shift in Daniel's expression. For years, he had believed he understood me. He believed he knew why I became guarded, why I avoided certain conversations, why I never explained myself when people made assumptions. Now he was beginning to realize that the story he had carried for decades was incomplete. I looked around the table and saw the same uncertainty on every face. Sophie sat quietly, still holding my hand. Rachel no longer looked impatient. She looked concerned. The old box remained open between us like a doorway into another life. Slowly, I picked up the hospital bracelet again. A few days after that visit, I said, your father and I sat together in our kitchen long after midnight. We had papers spread across the table. Bills, medical information, financial records. We were trying to decide what to do next. I could still picture that night perfectly. The yellow light above the table. The sound of the refrigerator humming. The fear neither of us wanted to admit out loud. That was the night he asked me for a promise. I continued. Daniel leaned forward. What was the promise? I took a breath. For 30 years, I had replayed that conversation in my mind. He asked me to let everyone believe certain things about me if it meant protecting the family. The room went silent again. Rachel frowned. I do not understand. Neither did I at first, I replied. I argued with him. I told him people would misunderstand. I told him the truth mattered. But he believed there was something more important than being understood. Sophie squeezed my hand. What? She whispered. I looked at her, making sure the people he loved would have a future. Daniel slowly shook his head. Mom, what does that mean? I reached into the box and removed another document. It was a bank statement from 30 years ago. The paper was worn from age. When our financial problems became serious, we faced a choice, I said. A choice that would affect every member of this family. Daniel studied the document. Rachel looked from the paper to my face. Neither of them spoke. Your father wanted you to finish school, I said quietly. No matter what happened. He wanted opportunities for you that he never had. He believed your future mattered more than his pride. Daniel's eyes narrowed with confusion. My future? Yes. I nodded. There were moments when we could barely keep up with expenses. Moments when giving up would have been easier. Memories flooded back. Long work shifts. Second jobs. Selling belongings. Smiling in front of family members while carrying worries nobody could see. But your father refused to let hardship define your future, I said. And when circumstances became more difficult, he asked me to carry a burden that he knew would eventually fall on my shoulders alone. Rachel lowered her eyes. Sophie looked close to tears. Daniel remained silent. I could see him trying to fit these pieces together. After that promise, I continued. People began noticing changes. They saw me working longer hours. They saw me making decisions they did not understand. They saw me becoming more careful with money. Over time, they created their own explanations. I offered a small sad smile. And because of my promise, I never corrected them. The old clock chimed in the hallway. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel spoke softly. You let us believe things that were not true? I nodded. Yes. For 30 years? Yes. He looked away and rubbed his forehead. The answer seemed impossible for him to accept. In many ways, it had been impossible for me as well. I glanced toward the folded letter resting beside the box. The letter contained the final piece. The piece that explained everything. The piece that would change how my family remembered the man they loved. And as I stared at his familiar handwriting, I realized that after tonight, the secret would belong to all of us. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The old letter remained on the table between us, and I could feel the weight of every year I had spent protecting its contents. Daniel stared at it, as though it might answer all the questions he had carried throughout his life. Sophie sat quietly beside me. Rachel looked unsettled. The room no longer felt like the setting of a birthday celebration. It felt like a place where the past had finally caught up with the present. Slowly, I picked up the letter and unfolded it. The paper crackled softly. I had not read those words in years. Not because I had forgotten them, because I knew them by heart. Your father wrote this the week after we left the hospital, I said. He asked me not to share it until the time felt right. Daniel swallowed hard. What did he say? I looked down at the page. The familiar handwriting brought back memories so clearly that for a moment I could almost hear his voice. He wrote that if anything happened, he wanted me to protect the family first. Daniel lowered his eyes. Sophie listened carefully. Rachel remained silent. He wrote that he was afraid the truth would change how you saw him. The room became still. Why? Daniel asked quietly. Because your father believed he had failed us. I watched confusion cross his face. Failed us? I nodded. The financial problems were not caused by bad luck alone. Nobody moved. 30 years ago, your father invested nearly everything we had into a business opportunity that he believed would secure our future. He truly believed it would work. He wanted to provide more for this family. Daniel stared at me. Rachel slowly sat back in her chair. Sophie covered her mouth with one hand. The investment collapsed. I continued. Almost overnight. Our savings disappeared. The future we had planned disappeared with it. The silence deepened. Dad never told me that, Daniel whispered. No, I shook my head. Because he could not bear the idea of you. Seeing him as irresponsible. He blamed himself for everything that followed. Memories flooded back. The sleepless nights. The endless calculations. The worry hidden behind forced smiles. When the medical problems arrived shortly afterward, he felt trapped between two impossible realities. He wanted to protect his family, but he also believed the truth would burden you. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I could see the emotions moving across his face. Shock, sadness, understanding. So what happened? Rachel asked softly. I looked at the letter. Your father asked me to let people believe that I was the one making the difficult financial decisions. He wanted everyone to think I had become overly cautious, strict, obsessed with money if necessary. Rachel's eyes widened. Daniel slowly looked up at me. That is why everyone blamed you. I nodded. Yes. For decades, relatives whispered that I cared more about finances than feelings. Friends wondered why I worked so much. Even members of my own family assumed I had changed into someone colder. I never corrected them. He wanted you to remember him as the strong father who always had a plan, I said. And I agreed because I loved him. Tears appeared in Sophie's eyes. Daniel looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. All those years, he whispered. All those years I thought you chose that life. I smiled sadly. I know. The answer carried no bitterness. Only truth. The hardest part was not the work. It was watching people misunderstand why I was doing it. The old clock ticked softly in the hallway. Nobody seemed to notice. Every person at the table was looking at the same thing now. Not the box. Not the letter. Me. And for the first time in 30 years, they were beginning to see the woman behind the promise. For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody said a word. The silence felt different now. Earlier in the evening, it had been filled with curiosity. Now it was filled with realization. Daniel stared at the letter resting in front of me. Sophie quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Rachel looked down at the table as if she were replaying years of memories through a completely different lens. I understood exactly what they were feeling. That was the strange thing about truth. It did not change the past. It changed how people understood the past. Mom, Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you never tell me? The question hung in the air. It was not an accusation. It was something much sadder. A son trying to understand years that suddenly no longer made sense. I looked at him carefully, because every time I wanted to, I remembered the promise. He lowered his eyes. But I spent years thinking you were angry with me. My heart tightened. Of all the misunderstandings, that one had always hurt the most. I know, I replied softly. And there were many times I wanted to explain everything. More than you can imagine. Memories surfaced immediately. Birthday parties where Daniel seemed distant. Family gatherings where conversations felt forced. Holidays where I sat quietly while others interpreted my silence as disapproval. They never understood that I was simply carrying a burden I could not share. Do you remember when Sophie graduated from high school? I asked. Daniel nodded. Of course. I smiled sadly. That night you told Rachel that I never seemed happy anymore. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. She remembered it too. I heard you, I said gently. I was standing in the kitchen. Rachel immediately looked embarrassed. Evelyn, I did not mean. I raised my hand softly. It is all right. Because it truly was. Time had given me perspective. You were not the only person who believed that. Many people did. Sophie shook her head. I never thought that. I looked at her and smiled. You always saw more than most people. She reached for my hand again. The gesture nearly brought tears to my eyes. For years, Sophie had been the one person who stayed close even when she did not understand me. Grandma, she whispered, you gave up so much. I thought about that for a moment. The jobs, the long hours, the assumptions, the years spent being misunderstood. Perhaps, I said, but your grandfather gave up things too. We both did. Daniel looked at the photograph of the small white house. I spent so many years blaming you for things that were never your fault. His voice cracked slightly. I thought you chose work over family. I shook my head. No, I chose family over everything else. The room fell silent once more. This time nobody looked away. Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek. Daniel stared at the table. Sophie squeezed my hand. And for the first time in decades, I felt something lifting from my shoulders. Not because people finally knew the truth. Because they finally understood the reason behind it. There is a difference. Knowing facts is easy. Understanding sacrifice takes longer. I glanced around the room. The birthday decorations still hung from the walls. The cake remained half-eaten on the counter. A few wrapped gifts sat unopened in the corner. Hours earlier, everyone thought this evening would be about celebrating another year of my life. Instead, it had become something much more important. It had become a chance to recover 30 years of lost understanding. I looked at the box one final time. Only a few items remained inside. The last pieces of the story. The pieces that would explain why I had chosen tonight to finally break my silence. And as I reached for the final document, I realized that what came next would matter more than everything that had come before. I lifted the final document from the box and held it carefully between my hands. Compared to everything else on the table, it looked ordinary. Just a single sheet of paper folded in half. Yet it was the reason I had finally chosen to speak. Daniel watched closely. Sophie sat beside me with tears still shining in her eyes. Rachel remained silent. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. This is the last thing your father ever asked of me, I said softly. I unfolded the paper and looked down at the familiar handwriting. He wrote this several months before he passed away. My voice remained steady, but my heart was full. In this letter, he told me that one day there would come a time when keeping the secret would no longer protect anyone. He said that when that day arrived, I should stop carrying the burden alone. Daniel lowered his eyes. Sophie listened carefully. I continued reading. In the letter, my husband thanked me for every sacrifice I had made. He thanked me for the extra jobs, the long nights, and the years spent protecting a version of him that allowed our family to remember him with pride. But near the end of the letter, he wrote something that changed everything. He wrote that he never wanted my remaining years to be defined by a promise made in fear. He wanted them to be defined by truth. I folded the paper and placed it gently on the table. For a long time, I ignored that part, I admitted. After he was gone, I told myself I was honoring his wishes by staying silent. But the truth is that I was also afraid. Afraid that sharing the story would change how everyone remembered him. Afraid that it would not matter anymore. Daniel shook his head slowly. It matters, he said. His voice was filled with emotion. It matters a lot. Rachel nodded quietly. Sophie squeezed my hand. For the first time in years, I felt completely seen. Not as the woman people assumed I was. Not as the woman shaped by misunderstandings. But as myself. There is one more reason I waited until tonight, I said. Everyone looked at me. I smiled softly. Because I finally realized that love and truth should never be enemies. The room remained silent. Your father was a good man. He made a mistake. We all do. But one mistake is not the whole story of a person's life. Daniel wiped his eyes. Sophie smiled through tears. Even Rachel looked emotional. And neither are the assumptions people make about us. I continued. For 30 years, many people believed things about me that were never true. Some of those misunderstandings hurt. Some lasted longer than they should have. But carrying anger would have been another burden. I did not want that either. I looked around the room at the faces of the people I loved. The birthday decorations still hung from the walls. The candles had long burned out. Yet somehow this felt like the most meaningful celebration of my life. Not because of gifts. Not because of cake. Because understanding had finally replaced uncertainty. Daniel stood and walked around the table. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around me. I hugged him. Back. Sophie joined us a moment later. Rachel quietly stepped forward as well. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Words were unnecessary. The years we could not change remained behind us. But the years ahead were still waiting. Eventually, I glanced at the old wooden box. 30 years of silence rested inside it. Letters, receipts, photographs, promises. I closed the lid gently and smiled. The secret was no longer hidden. The burden was no longer mine alone. And as I looked at my family gathered around me, I realized that the greatest gift I could leave behind was never money, property, or possessions. It was the truth. After 30 years, the truth had finally come home.